Have you ever wondered why, despite living in an age overflowing with information, people still passionately defend absurd ideas? Have you encountered someone who seems to have turned off their reasoning, repeating prepackaged phrases without any reflection? Why do so many people unquestioningly accept everything they hear, as though thinking for themselves is dangerous or even forbidden? The answer to these questions goes beyond mere ignorance. Dietrich Bonhoeffer argued that the real problem lies in something deeper and far more dangerous: stupidity. However, Bonhoeffer's concept of stupidity isn't about a lack of intellectual ability. He doesn't define a stupid person as someone with low intelligence, but rather as someone who has chosen to abandon critical awareness. It's not about intellectual incapacity, but a moral and social failure, a conscious decision to ignore reality, retreat into the comfort of the crowd, and reject the effort required to think independently. When people make such a choice, it weakens the fabric of society. Stupidity doesn't just halt progress, it actively protects what is wrong, strengthens injustice, and silences those who dare to speak the truth. What makes this phenomenon even more alarming is that those who succumb to it don't realize they are being manipulated. Instead, they genuinely believe they are right. In this way, ignorance becomes fortified by unshakable certainty, making it nearly impossible to confront or correct. Bonhoeffer warned that this kind of collective behavior represents a much greater threat than the ill-intentioned actions of isolated individuals. When stupidity spreads, it becomes a force that blocks independent thinking, justice, and freedom. That's why more than just learning facts, we must develop awareness. Reading, reflecting, questioning, these are acts of resistance. And in a world that rewards repetition and punishes questioning, thinking has become an act of courage. Have you noticed how certain absurd ideas gain momentum when a lot of people start repeating them at once? Have you noticed how in a group some people become more radical, more aggressive, and less willing to listen? It's as if simply belonging to a majority grants them some kind of immunity against doubt and reflection. Bonhoeffer made an unsettling observation. Stupidity, contrary to what many believe, is not merely an individual problem. It shows up more powerfully in collective environments. People who might think clearly on their own often give in to mechanical and irrational behavior when placed in social contexts marked by pressure, fear, or conformity. This is the key danger. Stupidity behaves like a kind of emotional contagion. It spreads through ready-made phrases, oversimplified ideas, hollow certainties, and slogans that bypass any real analysis. And once it's taken root, it feeds off of habit, repetition, and the laziness to think. The individual stops being critical and becomes merely a repeater of whatever the group accepts as truth. What's even more disturbing is that stupidity doesn't need hatred to do damage. It can be calm, smiling, even well-meaning. All it takes is for someone to stop thinking for themselves and start accepting everything automatically. That person then becomes easily manipulated, and often without realizing it begins to defend ideas that harm both themselves and others. Bonhoeffer pointed out that this kind of collective behavior is more dangerous than the isolated actions of malicious people. Evil requires effort. Stupidity doesn't. It only needs passive acceptance. And that's why fighting this phenomenon demands something deeper than simply teaching information. It requires cultivating critical consciousness and intellectual courage. How can an entire society support, or at least tolerate, regimes that violate freedom, promote abuse, and silence dissenting voices? How do so many ordinary citizens become fervent defenders of systems that more often than not silently oppress them? During the authoritarian regime led by Mussolini in Italy, these questions became even more urgent. What happened there wasn't simply the result of brute force, but a process of mass manipulation where fear and propaganda worked together to create a parallel reality. People began to accept and even defend the unacceptable, not due to a lack of intelligence, but because they stopped questioning. The power structure didn't need strong arguments to convince anyone. It just had to repeat lies with confidence, reinforce symbols of authority, and feed a false sense of security. The people in turn became complacent. Thinking hurt, doubting was risky, and so many fell silent. Others began to repeat with conviction everything they were told. The result was an environment where reason was replaced by blind obedience. What's most disturbing is that this logic isn't tied to a specific time or place. It can be repeated in any society that abandons critical thought and chooses the comfort of submission. In that context, stupidity becomes an ally of oppression. There's no need to use physical force when people have already surrendered their autonomy of their own free will. This chapter in history stands as a warning. When a collective rejects independent thought, it opens the door to regimes that thrive in the shadows of ignorance. And in this scenario, those who dare to see beyond and ask questions are seen as threats, not because they're wrong, but because they disrupt the system of illusions everyone else has accepted. The most alarming part is realizing that in this kind of environment, those who conform become defenders of the very system that limits them. Not because they understand what they're doing, but because they've come to see any dissenting voice as the enemy. Passivity becomes a shield for what's wrong. Stupidity, in this case, wears the uniform of loyalty. Tradition of, this is how it's always been. And that's exactly when it reveals its most dangerous face. Those who choose not to think end up serving without even knowing it, the interests of those in power. The cycle continues. The ones who dare to question are ridiculed, silenced, or pushed to the margins, while those who accept everything without resistance are applauded for their good behavior. In this environment, conformity is not only accepted, it's encouraged. Ignorance becomes a virtue, and anyone who tries to sound the alarm is treated as a traitor. Truth becomes uncomfortable. Lies become comforting. And so an unjust system can stay in place for years, not only sustained by the power of its leaders, but also by the active omission of a crowd that fiercely defends the very structures that keep it imprisoned. When this happens, there's no longer any need to censor information because the people themselves reject anything that might help them see clearly. The poison has been absorbed so deeply that any attempt at a cure is seen as a threat. The result is a society that revolves around the appearance of stability, but is at its core corroded by a denial of reality. This kind of scenario doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's carefully cultivated by those who understand the power of collective ignorance. And this is where stupidity reveals its usefulness as a tool of control. Governing bodies is difficult. Controlling minds is far more effective. A system that blocks critical thinking, discourages questioning, and rewards blind obedience doesn't need chains or prison cells. It only needs people who stop thinking. The manipulation of collective consciousness is subtle. It doesn't force, it seduces. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It feeds the ego with easy certainties, simplifies complex realities, and offers ready-made villains for every problem. When the mind grows accustomed to this kind of comfort, it loses the habit of inquiry. And once it's paralyzed, it becomes an instrument in the hands of those who benefit from keeping everything as it is. This is the silent power of institutionalized stupidity. It doesn't need explicit fear to spread. It only needs to become the easiest path. Modern structures of domination understand this well. That's why they don't need to erase ideas. They only need to suffocate the desire to seek them out. Ignorance in this context is organized. It comes packaged in polished speeches, shallow content, and catchy phrases that sound good but say nothing. This way, control is maintained without resistance. And the more people accept this condition as normal, the harder it becomes to break the cycle. Those who control the narrative don't need to repress directly. They just need to shape collective thinking so that no one even misses what was lost. When stupidity is cultivated as a standard of behavior, freedom becomes invisible, and for that very reason, even more dangerous to those seeking absolute control. The most unsettling realization is that even intelligence isn't a guaranteed shield against this kind of manipulation. Educated people with degrees and sophisticated vocabularies can also be swept away by the current of collective stupidity, because the issue isn't the ability to think, it's the choice not to. Within certain power structures, the official narrative becomes the only acceptable truth. To question it becomes a risk, a threat to the established order. Even the most rational minds may give in to the comfort of repeating what is socially safe, even when deep down they sense that something isn't right. Reason gives way to convenience. Intelligence without courage becomes a tool used to validate the system. This explains why we see seemingly lucid individuals defending incoherent ideas, refusing to hear different arguments or attacking anyone who dares to think outside the norm. The pressure to conform is silent, but powerful. And when the fear of being excluded outweighs the desire to seek truth, even the brightest minds dim. This dynamic was well explored by Carlo Cipolla, an economist who proposed a brutally honest theory. Stupid people are those who harm others and themselves without any real gain. It's a destructive and purposeless action driven by unawareness. The danger, according to him, lies in the fact that this kind of person acts without thinking, without evaluating consequences, and without recognizing the damage they cause. Unlike the malicious who know what they're doing and are chasing some benefit, the stupid have no plan and no clear goal. They act on impulse, repetition, or conditioned reflex. And that's why they're more unpredictable and often more harmful. They can be anywhere in leadership roles, in positions of influence, or simply spreading empty ideas with unshakable conviction. Stupidity in this sense is not a harmless or humorous flaw. It's an active force of social disintegration, and the more space it occupies, the harder it becomes to restore clarity, logic, and a collective sense of responsibility. Because it doesn't argue. It simply exists, spreads, and resists any attempt at healing through reason. This silent force reveals itself in terrifying ways when ordinary people are faced with difficult decisions. A famous experiment helped expose this. A group of volunteers was placed in a situation where they were instructed to deliver electric shocks, supposedly real, to others simply because an authority figure told them to. Most obeyed. Even when the victim screamed in pain, many continued saying only, "I'm just following orders." This experiment, conducted by Stanley McGrim, showed that blind obedience can turn anyone into an agent of absurdity, hatred, or evil intent wasn't necessary. All it took was the presence of someone who looked like an authority and the promise that everything is under control. The sense of responsibility vanished. Critical thinking was shut off, and the result was violence justified by passivity. The lesson is clear. Social stupidity doesn't arise merely from a lack of knowledge, but from the refusal to take ownership of one's moral awareness. When we let others do our thinking for us, we become part of a machine that can cause deep harm, often without even realizing it. Today, this scenario no longer requires lab coats or laboratories. It happens every day quietly through screens, notifications, and endless distractions. We live in an age where information is everywhere, but reflection has become rare. Modern alienation is no longer caused by the absence of data, but by the inability or the refusal to interpret it with depth. We're bombarded by headlines, short videos, and ready-made opinions. Constantly, shallowness has become the norm. And the more distracted we are, the easier it becomes to accept any narrative that brings us comfort. Truth often demands effort, but a well-LD lie only needs a click. The problem is that when we give up depth, we make room for a kind of ignorance that comes dressed in charm. It's no longer about not knowing, but not wanting to know. It's a voluntary escape from reality, a collective anesthesia that turns society into a grand stage of unconscious repetition. And when that becomes the norm, stupidity is no longer the exception. It becomes the default environment. And anyone who tries to step outside of it is seen as strange, dramatic, or even dangerous. When this state of mental numbness becomes normalized, something even more serious begins to happen. Passivity transforms into a direct threat to freedom. Democracy, which depends on debate, listening, and independent thinking, begins to silently collapse, not from an external attack, but from within, corroded by the apathy of its own citizens. The fear of being rejected, of seeming different or difficult, leads many to simply go with the flow. People start policing themselves not because they're forced to, but out of habit. They give up questioning in exchange for belonging. The diversity of ideas which should strengthen coexistence starts to feel like a nuisance, and slowly thinking differently becomes a social crime. Even if there's no law against it, intolerance toward differing opinions is a clear symptom of a society in decline. Silence starts being mistaken for virtue and repetition for wisdom. In this environment, Democracy stops being a space for collective building and becomes a stage where everyone pretends to agree, not because they believe, but because they're afraid to stand alone. This fear is fed by an ecosystem that has become increasingly efficient at shaping opinion. Social media, a space that once promised freedom of expression, quickly turned into an arena of emotional manipulation. Algorithms don't reward truth. They reward engagement. And what engages most? Anger, fear, scandal, division. These platforms create ideological bubbles that reinforce everything we already believe, excluding anything that challenges us. And the more time we spend inside these bubbles, the more certain we feel, even when we're completely wrong. It's an illusion of clarity sustained by repetition and manufactured confirmation. The problem is that in this environment, truth loses ground to popularity. The content that reaches the most people isn't always the most honest. It's often just the most emotional. Inflamed, simplistic ideas go viral. Deep reflections get ignored, and so the fertile ground for stupidity expands. More noise, less listening. More certainty, less thinking. The result, a society that believes it's more connected than ever, yet grows increasingly isolated in its own convictions. Where everyone's talking, but almost no one is really listening. Faced with all this, one inevitable question arises. How do we break the cycle? Is there any way out when thought has been replaced by repetition, doubt by shallow certainties, and truth by convenient narratives? The answer doesn't lie in grand external revolutions, but in a quiet internal gesture, reclaiming intellectual autonomy. The first step is simple but profound. Start questioning. Question what we hear, what we repeat, what we accept without reflection. Question even the things that comfort us, because true thinking requires the courage to face the discomfort of being wrong. Great thinkers have warned that the antidote to stupidity isn't accumulating information, it's developing awareness. It's not about knowing more, but about thinking better. Reading, deep listening, respectful debate, and personal reflection are tools of resistance. Resistance against collective numbness, against the dulling effect of conformity, and against the fear that paralyzes. Reclaiming independent thought is at its core an act of freedom and also of responsibility, because thinking clearly forces us to see things we once pretended not to notice. We begin to recognize contradictions, absurdities, abuses, and that demands us to take a stand. Thinking in this world saturated with noise is swimming against the current, but it's also the only way not to be swept away by it. Intellectual autonomy pulls us out of autopilot and gives us back the ability to choose consciously. It makes us less manipulable, less predictable, less useful to agendas that feed off our distraction. Thinking, therefore, is a political, moral, and existential act, a gesture that reconnects us to what makes us truly human. And even if this process feels lonely at first, it always ends up reaching others. Because awakened thinking is contagious, it illuminates, it provokes. And when one person begins to step out of the cave, others start to realize there's more outside than the shadows cast on the wall. But it's not enough to just think for ourselves. We must also think with humility. Intellectual autonomy can only stand if it's accompanied by the awareness that we might be wrong. And that's one of the hardest attitudes to develop. Admitting that even with the best intentions, we might have misunderstood, exaggerated, or simply repeated something without checking. Intellectual humility is not weakness. It's maturity. It's the recognition that the world is far too complex to be reduced to simple, absolute answers. It's knowing that doubt is an essential part of the path to knowledge, and that truly listening is just as important as arguing. Without that humility, we risk trading one form of stupidity for another, just more sophisticated, more arrogant, more blind. We can fall into the trap of feeling superior to others just because we think differently. But real thinking also means knowing when to be quiet, when to rethink, when to go back and reconsider. Openness to dialogue is one of the clearest signs of a lucid mind. Those who can't stand being questioned are often more afraid of the fragility of their ideas than confident in their truth. But those who understand that reality is always bigger than any one opinion can grow through the clash of perspectives. They learn from others even when they disagree. This attitude is a powerful form of resistance. In a polarized world where everyone wants to win an argument, the person who's willing to listen creates space for transformation. While stupidity slams doors, humility opens paths. While ignorance shields itself with arrogance, clarity walks hand in hand with doubt. And it is this attitude, simple yet revolutionary, that can help us break the cycle of unconscious repetition. Because real learning only happens when we recognize that there's still much more to learn. In the end, the fight against stupidity isn't a solitary mission, nor a task fulfilled by speeches alone. It's a collective process, built through continuous effort, small daily choices, and above all, courage. Courage to think when everyone else prefers to repeat. Courage to question when silence feels safer. Courage to act when a mission has become the norm. No true transformation happens in comfort. Resisting the rise of organized ignorance requires discomfort. It demands exposure. It means losing certain social advantages in the name of something greater. But that is the essence of consciousness. Realizing that truth is worth more than acceptance, that clarity is worth more than easy applause, and that freedom, real freedom, must be sustained by active living thought. That's why we must reflect. Are we part of the solution, or are we feeding the problem? Our words, our choices, our silences, all of it weaves the invisible fabric that holds society together. And when the aware falls silent, manipulators gain ground. When the lucid give up, the irrational celebrate. To think in this context is an act of resistance. To engage in dialogue is an act of courage. And to remain open to learning is a sign of maturity. There is no magic formula, no final answer, but there is a path. And that path begins when we stop merely reacting and start understanding. If we want a more conscious and more humane society, we must begin with an inner cleansing, pushing away arrogance, mental laziness, and the comfort of ready-made answers, and rediscovering the value of doubt, of deep listening, and of an honest search for truth. Because in the end, the real danger isn't in those who think differently from us, but in those who no longer think at all.